Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us to the lunchtime lecture this week. We have the privilege of hosting a brilliant office from Canada, consisted of Mason White and Lola Sheppard. It is one of my favorite offices in the world and dear friends. So I'm very happy to introduce Lateral Office today and their lecture, Piles, Drifts, Freezers, and Icebreakers. Just a few words on their bio. Lateral Office is an experimental practice that was founded in 2003 by Mason White and Lola Sheppard, focusing on architecture's entanglement with the environment. In their own words, their practice is a commitment to design as a research vehicle to pose and to respond to complex, urgent questions in the built environment, engaging a wider context and a climate of a project in its ecological, social, and political dimensions. They have received a number of very important awards, including a National Urban Design Award, a Progressive Architecture Award, a Holcim Foundation for Sustainable Construction Gold Award, the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, and the Canada Council for the Arts Professional Prix de Rome. They have also been invited to all of the biennials in the world, the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2015, the Seoul Biennale of Architecture in 2017, the Oslo Architectural Triennale, and today they will present research stemming from their recent book, Many Norths, Spatial Practice in a Polar Territory, published by ACTAR in 2017. Just to introduce their subject a little bit, I will start with my own personal enchantment with the Arctic North, the territory that they're analyzing in a forensic way, like intellectual detectives, and at the same time, they're paying tribute to it as what I would call fallen subjects of erotic fascination with the North. The white, vast, frozen, varied, and multiplicitous polar terrain is as much a physical land as it is a state of mind that in many ways defies property and political sovereignty. It is a place where borders loom as the weakened fantasies of nation states that are forcefully projected on the land through borders. It is the material and existential conditions of that land that mark the transactional modalities of how to occupy it. Arctic's domain are linked recently also with the threat of the carbon bomb posed by the release of carbon dioxide and methane from melting permafrost, and other dangers of the climate crisis. Inhabiting this land, therefore, requires knowledge, specificity, and intimacy in the potential to harvest, calm, and redistribute resources in a conductive and collaborative form of cohabitation with the forces of the environment. Lateral Office's book brings to light the challenges of this cohabitation in Northern Canada, unveiling a shadowed battle between Arctic Canada's Aboriginal populations and its modern colonizers. As they write in a recent article, architecture has played a subtle yet forceful role in transforming the Canadian Arctic, arguably becoming the most legible tool of internal colonialism during the region's dramatic modernization of the past century. As they document, Inuit building practices have long been attuned to variations in season, food sources, and sociocultural traditions. The permanent housing typologies imported by the Canadian government, such as the insulated plywood house and the prefabricated frame house, demonstrate a wasteful use of resources, requiring year-round settlement and thus utilizing architecture as a tool of internal colonialism within Canada. This important book is preceded by their work for the Canadian 2014 Pavilion for the Venice Biennale that Lateral Office has curated. Arctic Adaptations was a very important pavilion that has garnered international acclaim and a special distinction from the Venice Biennale, focusing on architecture's role in the Inuit communities of Nunavut, the country's youngest and most northerly territory. As they stated, from igloos to internet, using interactive models and photography, Lateral Office examined whether architecture and infrastructure largely used as tools of colonization over the last 100 years, can also help to shape and reimagine these Arctic settlements without sacrificing, as they state, their unique identity. At this time, when it is critical for educators, a time when we're all called to acknowledge the oppressive violence of having neglected Indigenous cosmologies, speculating on the Arctic vernacular might offer valuable ways out into a critical biocentric model of architecture and political economy based on environmental consonance and social equality. So with these words, I would like to welcome in a very endearing way, Mason White and Lola Sheppard.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for such a thoughtful and kind introduction. And we feel really fortunate that you've included us in this really exciting lecture series and very urgent lecture series that Cooper Union has organized this semester with some fantastic speakers touching on some very timely and necessary topics. Thank you so much for your kind words and including us in this incredible set of speakers. First, just before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the land that we are located on. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory here is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant and wampum between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Three Fires Confederacy, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources in and around the Great Lakes. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of Toronto, are still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we hope you will take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently live there, and will live there in the future. So we are going to, I may need to do that again. I need to share my overall screen because we might do some toggling between things here. We are going to present, as Lydia has pointed out, some of our work on the Arctic. And actually, Lola and I have been broadening the regional specificity of our work. As Lydia pointed out, the Venice Biennale was focused on the region of Nunavut, which is Inuktitut, that means our land, to translate that. And we have broadened a little bit more to consider a larger context for that region as relating to the idea of rural and remote, and actually very much thinking about architectural biases towards urbanism, and in what way has that impacted practice, in what way has that impacted research, in what way has that impacted even the education of the architect, to borrow a Cooper Union phrase, and thinking about this sort of urban bias. So we're going to start off with actually a series of prompts to those that are joining us today. How do we look past our urban bias and assumptions about rural and remote regions? And here we might think of an urban bias dating back certainly within the 20th century, from even figures like Doxiadis, and thinking about the ecumenopolis and this sort of larger ideas about urbanization as a inevitability, and urbanization maybe as a sort of emblem of progress. In what way do we bias urbanism as the embodiment of modernity? Might be a question we might think of. And even thinking larger scale here, Neil Brenner and his Urban Theory Lab at Harvard, sort of privileging the idea of planetary urbanization, even thinking beyond our previous notions, the kind of Doxiadis notions of urbanism, thinking about it at a planetary scale. These are things that preoccupy us because we're thinking about the connections between our urban lives and the land and the regions that are needed to sustain our urban lives. Even if we think about the way in which our assumptions about rural space, in this case, this is OMA's recently opened, just pre-COVID, Countryside, the Future exhibition at the Guggenheim, and the way in which this carries with it rural assumptions about rural space and what might be the service capacity of rural regions or remote regions in how they sustain, again, urban lives. And this is one of the drawings in that exhibition that unpacks a previously seen sort of innocuous countryside space as actually being encrusted with a series of kind of techno landscape spaces or techno service spaces. So what might previously look pastoral actually is technocratic, is part of the industrial complex, is part of the hinterland that sustains urbanization. And another question we might ask is another question that we ask, Lola and I, what existing spatial practices are already making and remaking rural and remote regions? And maybe a postscript here is, what is spatial practice? To us, this idea, we see ourselves as spatial practitioners rather than exclusively architects through the kind of professional registration. And identifying as a spatial practitioner allows one the liberty to move between disciplines, and it also allows the liberty of others to join you as a spatial practitioner that might not have a degree or may not be qualified or may not previously be seen to have expertise of that nature. And this was the subtitle of our book, Many Norths, Spatial Practice in a Polar Territory, which is a way of inviting others like hunters or even engineers or others that might not previously be designated as designers within this sort of realm. So what existing spatial practices might be there? So this map may not be familiar to you, but this is Canada. It's a very large nation, second largest, maybe the second largest in the world. And all of the urban regions that you see, or all of the populated regions you see in this map, are these little black circles, are above the 60-degree line. And this is what commonly or colloquially might be referred to as the North, very broadly. There are many different ways in which to describe that northern quality. And this is composed of the territories, Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, but also northern Quebec, known as Nunavik, and a portion of Newfoundland Labrador, which is known as Nunatsiavut. These are basically combined with basically a remote and rural region, but also a predominantly indigenous region of the country. And common popular knowledge, even amongst Canadians, is that this region is empty. This is a common phrase, is, why do people even live here? There is nothing there. It's too cold. It's impossible to live there. And yet, Inuit and indigenous inhabitants of the North, Dene, Gwich'in, and many others in the West, have, of course, do not see that land as empty. And instead, this is, for example, a land resources map produced by the Canadian Circumpolar Institute in the '70s, which was basically a negotiating tool between the Canadian government and indigenous people to assess what will become, quote, crown land and what will remain indigenous treaty-based land, you might see it as that, or Inuit-owned land, IOL. And so this is basically a documentation, a set of drawings, an incredible document of about 150 maps that were drawn to articulate where resources might be found in the region, and where you might find hunting grounds and other sorts of qualities to the environment. So this land is not empty. This is another, probably one of my favorite maps as part of this study, or actually this is a much later study, which is a documentation of the small hamlet of Nain, Labrador, predominantly indigenous region, which shows the way in which snowmobiles move across the frozen rivers out into the land to go hunting. So all of these lines are, it's basically showing the kind of regional access routes from the dense hamlet outward for fishing, hunting, travel out on the land.
And I would say this is really emblematic of this notion of spatial practice, right? Of how different people occupy and move through and understand the land. And this is a perhaps more colonial understanding of movement on the land, or in this case, in the water. One of the surprisingly few icebreakers that clear paths for shipping and access to the north. And this speaks to the kind of tools and devices and technologies that we have developed over time to enable other forms of sort of spatial practice in the north. So the other question is, what vernaculars are defining and rural and remote regions, and what new vernaculars might emerge as we think about the kind of contemporary condition? And so on the one hand, there's very much a kind of emerging indigenous youth that are hybridizing traditional knowledge, traditional culture, and very contemporary practices. So this is a photo series done by a photographer friend of ours of Inuit youth in their home and out on the land. And you see these kind of hybridizations. And the north is generally, many of the communities have very young populations. So you have this kind of constantly transforming cultural condition. And one of our observations was that architecture has not been nearly as innovative and adaptable as the people who live there. And this is a sort of documentation of some of the northern vernaculars. We'll go into much more detail as we present some extracts of the book, but these sort of perhaps de facto vernaculars that have emerged, the local grocery store, the community freezer, the imposition of multiplex housing, the infrastructural needs that enable modern inhabitation, so fuel and water delivery, how people move on the land, so the ATVs and snowmobiles as well as trucks. All these sort of elements, both ephemeral and permanent, are part of the kind of emerging northern vernacular.
So we love this prompt of landing and the relation architecture in the age of extinction and other entanglements. Piles, drifts, freezers, and other icebreakers is what we've called it. And we see this as a kind of inquiry into the possibility of an Arctic vernacular. We hope we can articulate what we mean by that and why this term vernacular maybe is important to this conversation. So we will show some case studies from the book, Many Norths, and we'll show two projects that are actually on the board, which we have never presented before. In fact, we didn't have many presentations drawings of these projects because we've spent so much time through conversation working on these two projects. So we'll talk about those. And we had left some time for a postscript called Boom Bust, but I'm already seeing that we might not have time for that, but that's okay. We'll call that one of the bonuses or outtakes, or we'll make that a B-side for another lecture. The book Many Norths, as Lydia spoke about, really came out of the cutting room floor of work that was going into the Arctic Adaptations Project exhibition in Venice in 2014. So it kind of started, I guess, just a year before that. We felt like, oh, maybe there's a book that's going to come here. And of course, in the euphoria of Venice, was convinced that we would debut this book when the exhibition opened, and then quickly realized that's not going to happen. Partly because there was just too much time working the exhibition, but also partly because we didn't feel like the project was quite ready or done, or we hadn't really completed it. And there were a number of interviews we hadn't yet conducted that we wanted to go in there. And there was a number of writing projects we wanted to go in there. So anyway, it came out a good 3 years after Venice, but it stemmed from a lot of the observations related to the study of the Canadian Arctic. And For example, we certainly understand that the Arctic is seen, we know of its history, or maybe also you might know of its history as a logistical space, its history as both a distance early warning line. There was a Canadian-US collaboration on setting up what's called the DEW line, which is a kind of warning system that the Americans wanted during the Cold War in anticipation of any advances by the Russians. It's also a space for telecommunications and communications. But there has been, through colonial actions and through relocation of people, there has also, the 20th century has also been a story of unjust forms of urbanization and settlement creation. This is one of those. This is Rankin Inlet in Nunavut, which is on the western edge of Hudson Bay, which is about 3,000, population 3,000, 4,000.
And I think that, you know, architecture and urban planning have very much been tools of colonization. They were sometimes deliberate and sometimes unintentional, but impositions of ways of life. There are some shocking documents, handbooks on how to teach Inuit how to live like Southerners, how to use their house like Southerners. And these photos sort of speak of some of the residue of this,
right.
And the failure of architecture socially, but also technologically. They are often failing and leaking and falling apart.
And this example here, this is Iqaluit, which is the capital of the Eastern Arctic territory known as Nunavut. And this is a population of about 7,500, 8,000 inhabitants, of which only about 50% are indigenous, or Inuit in this case, partly because it's a kind of government seat. It's a capital of that region. And so there's a lot of Southerners who have moved up here for job opportunities or for places in government. And this area actually right here where my mouse is, if you can see it, is sort of the origin of this city, which started, of course, out as a US military camp known as Frobisher Bay. It has since been renamed to Iqaluit, which means place of many fish. And you can see some of the forms of architecture that are there.
This is one of our favorite photos. It's taken, it's 3 Inuit youth standing in front of a new school that was built in 72 or 73, I believe, by a Quebec architect who did some pretty remarkable buildings, problematic, but fascinating buildings. And he really saw the landscape as this kind of lunar, otherworldly landscape. And so you see this kind of imposition of modernity through architecture, and then these Inuit youth that are wearing the kind of clothes of the day, flannel, plaid, and this kind of juxtaposition of landscape, architecture, and people. So one of the things, you know, when we started out the book, the question was, how do we even define the North? And there are, you know, going back to Mason's earlier point, many ways. One can, as he mentioned, sort of take the 60-degree latitude. One can look at the tax benefit line, where you get tax benefits in recognition of the difficulty of living. You can look at it ethnographically, where the Inuit live. You can look at it in terms of where the tree line is, so the point beyond which there are no more trees. You can look at it in terms of the line of continuous permafrost, the point at which the land is permanently frozen, although with climate change, that is that line is changing. And this has impacts for where you build, how you build where. One can look at it in terms of the Arctic ecozone, so ecologically. One can look at it in terms of the southern road axis, so the point beyond which there are no roads. And this is hugely significant, that most of the Canadian North is accessible only by boat for a brief window of time in the summer, and otherwise by plane. And so this has huge impacts on the provision of services, obviously construction, and so forth. And then one can look at it as an important Quebec geographer named Louis-Edmond Hamelin spoke about, in fact, he famously said there are so many Norths in this North, and that was an inspiration for the title of our book. And he developed this indices for different degrees of North: base North, far North, extreme North. And this was calculated based on how cold it was, the degree of economic development, the degree of infrastructural development, and so forth. And so what becomes clear is there are many Norths, and that depending on the issue you are looking at, the geographic zone will likely change. And this was a sort of central driver of our research and our case studies, were these sort of multiple understandings of North.
And so the book was really organized into a set of chapters thematically. Again, looking at this idea of spatial practice, we had urbanism, architecture, mobility, monitoring, and resources. And what you're seeing in blue in each chapter is the case study. There was also a series of interviews, I think about 3 interviews within each chapter, sometimes speaking with a hunter. For example, in the resources, there's an interview with a bowhead whale hunter that was actually the captain of a bowhead whale hunt done in 2014, 2013, I believe it was. There's an interview with a ice road truck driver talking about what it is like to organize and drive and prepare for accessing these ice roads. And
I was just going to say that I think that the chapters reflect an observation we came to early on, which is that what is shaping the North, architecture has a very small role in that in fact, it is all a whole host of forces, including military and scientific monitoring, resource extraction, mobility. These are as important in the making of a kind of contemporary Northern condition as urbanism or architecture are. So we create the sort of each chapter began with a timeline that was a kind of Cole's notes, an introduction for those that were less familiar, that spoke to key events in relation to each chapter. So in urbanism, we might speak to policy initiatives, important urban plans that had been conceived of, and so forth. And so we did this for each chapter. So here's a kind of zoom in of some of the content. This was yeah, this is for the architecture chapter. So this was a kind of orientation device that introduced each chapter. So we're going to show you 5 or 6 case studies, one from probably each chapter. The first one is looking at Northern utilities, and a particular case study of Inuvik, which you see up here. And Inuvik was a newly planned town. It was a case of relocation where the original town, Aklavik, suffered from flooding. And so they proposed an entirely new town in the 50s. And as part of the plan, they had to deal with how energy and water would be delivered. So this is a regional map, that sort of shows the different sources of energy. Fuel is we ship up fuel once yearly is the kind of primary way that the North receives its energy, which is obviously problematic from an environmental perspective. And so this is the town plan. And what was shocking is that it was seen also as a kind of administrative town. And so those that were Southern white people received proper infrastructure that was serviced through a utilidor, which we'll speak about. And the Inuit basically were told to rely on honey buckets, so a pail. And so immediately infrastructure becomes a kind of racial and political instrument that produces areas of desirability and not. So the utilidor is a distinctly Northern innovation that is what carries water and fuel above ground when you can't run the pipes below ground because of the frozen ground conditions. And so you see here the kind of map. The blue is the original utilidor layout. The black, I believe, is the extension that was sort of added as the community grew. They get water from a local lake, which is fairly common. That then cleans it and delivers it. And this is the actual utilidor. And what's I think sort of fascinating and striking to us is this infrastructure, which in our cities is invisible, becomes very pronounced. It shapes the kind of urban form. Often there are walkways paired with these, so people are actually walking atop of these infrastructures. And they become a kind of constant reminder of what it takes to service a town in this extreme environment.
Another case study we did was looking at the importance and role of snow fences. And maybe this is not as common, certainly in New York or New York City, but snow fence is basically a defense wall, you might say. Actually quite common in southern Canada, in Manitoba, where you don't often have as many trees, or in the prairie lands where sometimes there isn't a way to stop horizontal moving snow. So the snow fence is basically a way to catch and capture and encourage the deposit of granular snow. And you can see maybe by this series of diagrams here of how the snow fence works. Through subtle openings in the fence, it slows down the wind just enough to get the snow, the horizontally blown snow to drop and be deposited. And so therefore the downwind drift, this kind of drift condition, appears on the backside of a fence. And on the left here, these are a series of studies of communities that have a community scaled snow fence. So it's not a snow fence that's built for an individual house or an individual person. Instead, it's a municipal project that's actually built to service a series of homes or a number of buildings. Take, for example, the second one on the left called Baker Lake. You can see 3 fences in a row working as a defense mechanism. So here in Iqaluit, you can see a series of these fences that are aligned, that basically are seen as a kind of front line from the strongest wind direction of horizontally.
It's essentially an artificial forest.
True, it's a way to kind of recreate what a tree might do, or what a series of trees might be doing. So for foundations, there's how the building touches the ground, or how buildings touch the ground, is quite important, because you can't have architecture warming up the ground through its heat that comes off of it, because it will subside. Buildings will subside if they're placed anywhere near permafrost. So there's a number of techniques for that. Sometimes there's something called thermosiphons, which are meant to sort of take heat out of the ground. The simplest ways are actually just literally to lift the building up off of the ground and to allow the air to pass beneath it, therefore encouraging air to the wind to blow any warm air coming out from the building away from the ground. So a space frame might be a conventional technique. There's also piles. Piles are increasingly more common technique actually in most of the Arctic, for allowing a building to just hover above the ground a certain dimension. And
huge numbers of buildings are effectively starting to collapse in northern communities because the ground is subsiding. And so, you know, they will jack up houses manually, the way you'd shim a cupboard in your house that's on uneven floors. So there's huge energy that goes into this challenge. Another case study that was from the mobility chapter was looking at the role of Sealift. So as I mentioned, most communities have no roads. And so we tracked at a kind of, in this case, national scale, the infrastructure and points of departure for these boats that then go and travel from community to community. There are about 4 or 5 companies that do these deliveries. They go up usually twice a year, once in sort of July and once in October. And basically, if you want a snowmobile, if you want an IKEA sofa, if you want a lot of dog food, you put your order in April and it gets delivered. And they often talk about Christmas in August in these northern communities when the boats arrive. And what's sort of striking is that very few communities have proper port infrastructure. And so this is, Iqaluit is only getting its first proper deep sea port next year, I believe, after decades of requests. And the consequence of not having a proper port is that you will get these cargo ships like the one you see to the left that have to moor in the bay, and then a smaller cargo ship or a smaller tugboat basically is bringing sea cans back and forth as it navigates dramatic tides. And so something that should take, a half day ends up taking 4 days, but it becomes part of the kind of communal landscape. And these sea cans often get left in the communities and then get repurposed as storage or as spaces for craftsmen to do carvings. And so there's a kind of permanent residue that is also left from this sort of infrastructural system. This actually says monitoring, but another case study from the mobility is a much more ephemeral form of kind of movement in the north, which is the sort of millennia old movement of Inuit on the land for hunting throughout the seasons. And so this is actually visualizations of work done by an anthropologist who worked with elders over a decade, where he would give them GPS and they would track their traditional trails. So this is the kind of regional network on the left of trails that they take. Looking at the role of place names, there's an important French anthropologist, Béatrice Collignon, who's looked a lot at the role of how Inuit name places as kind of navigational devices and orientation devices. There's, of course, the famous, 42 terms for snow, and that the snow has very sort of specific conditions that make it better for traveling or building and so forth. And then the drawing on the right is a kind of attempt to visualize, on the left, I apologize, is an attempt to kind of visualize how Inuit, based on research and conversations we did, navigate the land. And so they have very specific ways. They'll count the ridges, they'll look at the topography, they'll note whether they're moving across the grain or with the grain. So I think part of the book was also trying to visualize things that architects often don't look at, and expanding the range of things that we look at, and looking at it at multiple scales.
And part of this language, it relates to safety. This is a way not just to read the landscape, to navigate it, but it's also survival, right? Like knowing the difference between, let's say, a ridged drift or whether the snow has a kind of sparkle to it. It tells you temperature, it tells you sometimes thickness of snow, it tells you how recently wind blew on it, and whether what you're seeing is what you should believe, like its thickness or safety to travel. So that's quite important. And even this sort of, this is a study of a very dense and packed travel trip for hunting, or maybe for travel, which is using a camotic. And a camotic is basically a sled, is the Inuktitut word for sled, but it's actually even more than just a sled the way we might think of it. It's truly a kind of like vessel, right? It's literally a land vessel that can carry a number of items. And for sea ice monitoring, this is something that many different characters are interested in, whether it be scientists or, again, Inuit. So the way in which that sea ice, the many different types of sea ice, again, here we're using the Inuktitut terms for many of these different qualities of sea ice. Sea ice is just as nuanced and as important as snow itself. Being able to read fast freezing ice, or young ice, or first year ice, multi-year ice, and thaw holes that are first emerging from thawing versus puddles. So this allows for something like this to happen, where someone might be able to have the confidence to stand in this position that I'm sure very few of us would have the confidence to stand in. So this hunter with his spear ready to catch a seal. And so again, different stakeholders have different takes on measuring it, whether it be an ice road trucker understanding the safety of that thickness of that ice for traveling by vehicle versus hunters. And here's a scientific group that is using an ice auger for sampling the thickness of that ice. And I think our final case study in this series, Lola, do you want?
Sure. So this is one of our favorite, this is looking at mussel harvesting in northern Quebec, which is an area that has some of the highest tides in the world. I think it's 40 or 50 feet. And so they harvest mussels along the coast in the summer, which is where you see the kind of crosshatch. And they will go out onto the land, out onto the frozen sea, bay in the winter. And so they will make a kind of hole in the ice to start to get under the ice to harvest the mussels. So they will go out, they will make this hole. They will use the sled that you saw in the previous case study as a kind of ladder to go down below the ice sheet. And what's sort of extraordinary is the ice really forms a kind of cave or slab, and then the water is moving up and down depending on the tides, or receding, I should say. So they will go underwater, harvest the mussels, and then resurface. And whoops, oh, there's a photo. And so this is a photo of a young grandson with his grandfather. This is not one of our photos. It's taken by a professional photographer who had been in the region, harvesting these kind of, this delicacy that is the mussels. And so it speaks also to the idea that landscape is, has a kind of architecture and is very much practiced and experienced. These are in lieu of a index, we did a technology matrix that closed out the book, which was basically a kind of inventory of all the technologies that appear in the case studies. And in some ways, it was an argument that architecture is but one technology that enables inhabitation, and it is not really any different than a hammer or a sled or a rifle or a helicopter. And just to kind of close out the book before we jump into projects, we'll have to do it very quickly, is this idea that the research, often we didn't necessarily know how a case study might directly impact a kind of architectural design, but I think it was a recognition that I think this photo reminds us of, that there's this entanglement between architecture, land, climate, and spatial practices, which I read the sort of sled marks as, or the snowmobile marks. And this idea that you have to look at an environment that is unfamiliar to you in a more complex way than we are perhaps trained to as architects.
Okay, so I hope we have maybe another 15 minutes, if that's okay. We could try to blitz through two projects. I got the official digital thumbs up from Lydia. That's good. And I know Maurizio is the bully on timekeeper, so we'll keep an eye on any thumbs down from him. Okay, so we'll try to show two projects. These are on the boards for us right now, and actually have required patience that we normally don't have with our projects. The very humbling exercise of working in a different speed, in a different pace. But this project actually is quite old in terms of its origin. So it's even pre-Arctic adaptations Venice Biennale, but we really only started out on earnest a few years ago. And it was basically working with one of the people that we had met on our trip to Iqaluit, which again is the capital. Iqaluit is about here in my mouse, in the tip of Baffin Island. This is Baffin, beautiful Baffin Island here. Iqaluit is the capital. And Nunavut, let's take a moment to just look at Nunavut. So Nunavut again means our land in Inuktitut. It's established in the 1990s as an independent territory. Previously, it was part of Northwest Territories. It's composed of about 25 communities with 38,000 people spread across 2 million square kilometers. And this is the city plan of Iqaluit. It's actually rapidly growing. There's even great challenges in finding available land to build here, which is funny to think that how can you find available land to build? But because a lot of it is difficult, some of it is either sandy beach, or there's permafrost issues, or it's a berry picking area, or the land is too steep and too treacherous, or the land is already being used by infrastructure, like this entire southern portion here is landfill and fuel tanks and airport and sewage lagoons and things like that. So these hatched areas are planned as part of the municipal plan. They're areas for expansion. But this red dot that you see here is the site of this project, which is in the original kind of US military encampment site right at the beach of formerly Frobisher Bay. So here it's Kaidiartik Health Research Center, which is an independent health research organization, nonprofit that was established, I believe, in 2006. They currently occupy this house here within the kind of original military encampment established in the 40s and 50s. Many of those buildings actually even still date from that time. And she has purchased the land adjacent to her existing house and is actually going to relocate these two homes to construct a new building. Sure. And this is her current organization. They're actually occupying this house. And maybe I can take you on a quick tour, or Lola will take you on a quick tour. Is this still sharing? Can you still see our screen?
Do you share a video?
Yes.
Okay,
yes, okay,
great.
very good.
So this is, I was going to say hot off the press, but it's cold off the press. A friend of ours who's living in Iqaluit, who is going to take us through a brief drive through.
So even though it's COVID and you can't travel anywhere, you're actually getting to travel somewhere right now.
So this is, you know, the kind of central core of Iqaluit. Some interesting things. There are no sidewalks, and in fact, most of the roads aren't even paved because dirt roads work better in the cold. We're approaching on the right, on the left, you see the kind of striped building is a pool that was recently built at great expense and much debate about whether it was even culturally made sense to import a kind of southern infrastructure such as a pool. I'm going to kind of jump us ahead. This is approaching the main intersection of the town, which gets the biggest traffic jam in town. And there was a big debate about whether there should be a light.
There are no stoplights. This is called, people call it colloquially the four-way. So this is when you meet at the four-way stop sign.
This is kind of going down the main street of Iqaluit. A lot of the kind of buildings, there's even an Arctic College has some of its sort of buildings here. We're approaching now the North Mart, which is also, it was in the, on your, well, directly front / right, which is a bit like the kind of Walmart of every northern community where you get food and goods and so forth. And the bay is to your right.
The site of the project is just off to the right here too, next to this little blue house, just to locate you. So the project is located quite centrally.
And then here, actually, you see one of the schools to the left by the architect that we showed, this kind of lunar extraterrestrial building. He built several buildings in town, and I would argue developed a kind of vernacular. So you see it here. It's known as the Marshmallow Building. There's also the Igloo Cathedral, which was rebuilt after a fire, but which is also very iconic. I'm going to skip us ahead, but this is sort of giving you a kind of sense of the density, and there's something like 30 construction projects happening in Iqaluit right now. So while it seems small, it's actually rapidly growing. The other thing to note is you'll see in the buildings, there's this sort of architecture of addition, right? So there's the conventional shed, and then there's, and this is pretty common in all rural architecture in North America, but you know, the front porch is added on, or a side entrance is added on. And this is important for how we dealt with the building. So this probably gives you a good sense. Maybe we'll stop and take you back.
Yeah, so this is the site that our client currently is occupying. What kind of work they do? They do work that uses this kind of partnership model where they're working both with the community, but also with educators and also with policymakers and members of government that represent the community, and with youth and elders. So it's quite an inclusive model rather than a model that kind of partitions sort of, well, we do that and this other organization does this. These are some of the kind of workshops that they organize. So it's a very community-driven building. And one of the factors we were quite interested in thinking about environment and thinking about the challenges of making this big house for her was how to deal with snow. And this is a common challenge. For example, here's a recent headline from 2016, where this person, Brandon Alger's unfortunate home got, after a 50-hour blizzard, was entirely, his front door was dumped with snow. And so this is a common occurrence where a blizzard event, which happens every other year of this scale, could at any point deposit an inordinate amount of snow at your home. And many of these homes were not acclimated for that. So for the project, the scheme that we were looking at was to use a pile-based foundation that would allow what we spoke about earlier, lifting up of the building. And rather than seeing the project as one to sort of entirely defend against snow, we were trying to find creative ways to sort of invite the environment into different pockets. And so these kind of 6 areas are allowing the environment to come in different ways. The central cylinder that you see in the middle is inviting the sort of low light to come in. The 3 upper wedges that you see are about inviting the landscape in, literally the Arctic landscape, through an introduction of a green roof. And the 2 lower wedges are about acknowledging the potential of snow to accumulate and allowing for a perforated entry that would let snow actually drop back through even after it would come in. So these are those 2 entries, both a front entry and a side entry. This is a portrayal of the wind, predominant wind direction, pulling warm air away from the underside of the building, away from the ground entirely. And even at the upper level, the possibility for snow drifts and other conditions to be brought in through a sort of subtle curvature of the shaping and forming of the building. And so this is, rather than seeing snow as something to defend against, you might use it as for its insulative properties, or might use it to incorporate into a landscape feature. So this is the building sort of taking shape. It is, looking at the site plan, it is made up of a daycare on this eastern side, a community classroom on the western side with a shared office and all the kind of like daycare support functions at the back of the building. And this main central space is seen as a sort of welcome lobby area from which you circulate to any one of these functions. So it's kind of a hub. It's more of like a wellness hub is what our client is calling it. And up at the second floor, you have offices in the north and east and a community library on the south west portion, along with these 3 cutouts for green roof access. And so, speak about this.
So the building, in a way, each of those yellow volumes that you saw is in a way treated with a kind of skin. So this is a kind of unfolded elevation of the building with the yellow scoops that you see pulled out. And one of the things we were exploring is rather corrugated metals are kind of ubiquitous in the north, and we wanted to kind of embrace that, but we are trying to see if we can customize that corrugated metal to be a bit more like a curtain that sort of expands and compresses in its kind of density. And we were thinking of sort of the ice ridges that you see in the snow and landscape that also produce this kind of linear striated condition. So these are some of the kind of material experiments that we're pursuing. And so you see it on the exterior elevation, this kind of corten, which is slightly changing in density, and then, sorry, not corten, corrugated, and then the yellow scoops that mark entrance and upper level roof gardens. And then the Rotunda, which is this kind of hub space, as Mason said, is designed also to bring in light, low winter light, because the sun rises very little in the winter, and kind of diffuse it down. And that hub space is also sort of conceived of as wrapped with a skin. And we were sort of thinking partly of the kind of wood sled construction, but also the slots that you get in the traditional snow goggles that produce these kind of thin slits. And so that hub space is wrapped in this kind of wood liner, which you see, these are kind of early renders of it, that kind of wraps around. So this idea that every kind of key space has a kind of wrapper by which it is defined. So maybe very quickly we'll show one other project.
Yeah, so this project is in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. So this is more in sort of Western Arctic, more the territory of the Dene Gwich'in people. And this is the province of Northwest Territories, or the territory of Northwest Territories. Yellowknife is its capital. And you can see some of the different kind of diversity of language and governance of that from the different peoples, including the Yellowknife's people. Yellowknife is actually more, well, Northwest Territories is more populated than Nunavut. This is, I believe it's about 20,000, 21,000 inhabitants in Yellowknife.
And feels more familiar. It feels like some of the towns in Alaska. It's got high rises and its infrastructure looks more familiar, I would say.
The project really started actually with a studio I taught several years ago at University of Toronto that invited this Dene elder, Francois Paulette, who's an activist, knowledge keeper, and he visited University of Toronto and spoke to my students about traditional knowledge and ways of orienting and ways of life, ways of orienting the land and larger beliefs. And a few years later, I was able to revisit, this is Francois here in a contemplative state, to talk with them. He was actually he's a member of an elders council advising a hospital in Northwest Territories. It was about a $300 million hospital. And unfortunately, that hospital ended up declining its original offer to include an Indigenous wellness space. So this prompted a kind of activist stance to revisit a Indigenous specific wellness center. So this is one of our programming visits that we made. You can see these colored circles indicating a discussion around what should go in this building. We made a set of tools. Actually, this was probably where we embedded a lot of our early energy, was in making tools of conversation. What are architectural tools of conversation? So we made a series of almost game-like interfaces by which we could collaborate and co-design aspects of this project, both what might go in it, how it might find its way onto the site. And so these were these very simple, like canvas cut site plans. And these are a bunch of offcuts from other projects, plywood offcuts, that we sort of hacked into like a toolkit by which to look at massing and orientation and locating various projects. And it was a lot of fun. They took, you know, as a collaborative tool, it took off very well in terms of comparing programming ideas to planning, forming ideas, until we eventually arrived at this sort of collaborative understanding about program and form and site orientation. So these kind of three different buildings emerged. One that was about cultural gathering, one that was about traditional knowledge, and one that was about health and wellness, and that there would be a procession that would link them. And there were all these ideas about outdoor gathering spaces as well. This is near the edge of the site that was selected on Frame Lake, which is actually looking over at, that's actually a big hotel, but a more subtle building that you can't quite see is actually the Territorial Capitol building.
And it's worth noting that there's assorted gold mines that have left enough arsenic in this and neighboring lakes to kill the planet over several times. So
yes.
While it looks bucolic, we
not
have,
a good swimming hole. Not a good swimming hole.
Leveraged kind of immense destruction on some of this landscape.
Yes, and this is some of the beautiful Canadian shield rock that is exposed here with these really cute these really cute trees. Trees are very small here due to, again, soil depth, but also we're near getting close to the tree line, so trees get a little shorter. They had previously set up a wellness camp, and so we wanted to acknowledge this quality of making a camp and this idea of distinct building, or a kind of campus quality to it. And there were certain activities they wanted to take place on the land at this site. So this is another thing that we wanted to acknowledge on the site. So here you can see this really big mega hospital here. This is the $300 million mega hospital. This is basically a previous hospital that's being converted. So this is kind of already a health district. And this is the site that the territory was willing to allow the organization to study as a potential intervention. So this is us sort of studying like what are the environmental qualities, where are good views, where's the wind, what's public, what's private, where's natural clearings. So these kind of three chunks of programs started to emerge on the site. We were also trying to limit the degree to which we did any demolition at all. And in fact, we found a solution by which we make, the previous hospital had dynamited quite a bit of rock, and we are doing no rock damage or no dynamite work at all. All of this is done with kind of understanding the existing topography. This is the proposal as it is in regard to an approach to the entry. You can see these sort of three primary volumes here. This is the traditional knowledge wing. This is the ceremonial gathering space. And then this is the wellness wing, the farthest one away at the most kind of private location.
And it's worth just underscoring that for both these projects, and I think it's fair to say for most Indigenous communities, wellness is a much more holistic understanding than our clinical notion of health.
Right.
And hence the kind of presence of traditional language, traditional culture, crafts, going out on the land are all kind of key to the programming. So it's a very different mindset about health and wellness.
Exactly. So there's a number of scenarios looking at how the building might get used. So say, for example, somebody might be visiting from another community and would spend time in the traditional knowledge wing, where there might be small scale construction projects or on the land kind of exercises to practice the techniques of being out on the land for urban Indigenous people. Also a space for arts and crafts, and even a family center that combines with a library. So even some programs were hybrid, where there was an agenda for a library, but it wasn't intended as a traditional library, but maybe more as a sort of family space. Another experience might be within the sort of wellness wing. So this would be the street, or the sort of central procession space that combines these three buildings, so these three independent buildings into a kind of campus. And you can see some exposed rock on the interior. These are these great moments where we found in making the floor and surveying the land that there are moments where we could bring the warmth, the inherent warmth properties, the kind of thermal mass of the rock into the building. And this is actually a technique that a local architect, Gino Pin, has done in another project.
And there's an interest that the kind of structure is sort of akin to kind of trees. There's a kind of forest-like condition to the space.
So in the wellness wing, you might find a sort of medicine room that would be about both education and collection and preparation of traditional medicines. There, of course, would be a group discussion space or group healing space, conversation, and also private spaces for that. And then the ceremonial space, this would be from inside the procession looking at the ceremonial circular space, and inside it, this would be a space for either traditional activities or traditional celebrations, whether it be a drum circle or a rite of passage for someone into the status of an elder.
And this is, it should be noted, this is would be the only Indigenous health center in the whole territory. So it would be serving, I think it's 20,000 Indigenous people from a number of communities, and hence the scenarios of someone might fly in, someone might drive an hour, and someone might be local. So it's a kind of territorial notion of a social infrastructure, I guess.
And then the last space maybe to highlight is the negative space of this natural clearing for the high point. This is actually the high point on the whole exposed rock condition. And this is basically the equivalent of the indoor gathering space outdoors, which is literally a place for fire. Fire is such a critical and important cultural symbol, but also has quite literally has healing properties that are actual to people, as it does probably to all people.
So we're coming to the end. Part of the kind of research has been into sustainable building practices, and sustainable understood in the broadest sense of, passive strategies. So putting the kind of north-facing part of the building with fewer windows, opening the building up to the south. You see here the kind of cantilever, which allows low winter light, but cuts out the intense summer light, which is, of course, at some points of the year, almost 24 hours a day. Actually, also the shape of the building that is kind of intended to help deflect the snow or move it away from the building. And looking at also sustainability from a kind of cultural perspective. So, the idea Mason was saying of not blasting the ground, but pouring foundations that can literally sit on the rock and would just be locally pinned, or the community participating in some aspects of the construction. The idea of trying to source materials as locally as possible. Locally maybe a 500 to 800 kilometer radius, but using things within the kind of northern BC and Northwest Territories region. The idea of looking at, there's innovative new materials that, for instance, wood-based insulation products. So there's a kind of range of strategies that we're looking at that would allow the building to be in a kind of perhaps better dialogue than some northern buildings are. And then I guess the last thing to end on is, going back to what I was saying, this idea that the building is really tethered to a much larger geography. And as you saw in the site plan, it's crowded by a lot of sort of large infrastructural projects, but there's Frame Lake where people will go for walks. There's on the land healing camp that we showed you at the beginning, where people walk to. It's, I think, a 20-minute walk. There's proposals for further, like on the land healing camps that might be an hour away, where you would do an overnight trek. So this idea that the building is tied both immediately to its landscape through a set of kind of spatial practices, and then also to a kind of larger geography, I think is kind of key for us. And I will end it there.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for being patient with us. yeah, we're looking forward to talking with Lydia and anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mason and Lola. This was extraordinary as always. And I'm just amazed with the consistency of your work over the years and the way it gets more and more profound. So thank you for everything that you're doing and documenting. I will start with a question, but I think there's a number of really interesting questions also in the chat. I'll base my question on something that you said while describing the first project about the snow, how it was an intention. And I think that also describes different kinds of strategies and projects about how a building is not a defensive mechanism against, let's say, environmental conditions, as in a barrier between the forces of the environment, but as manifest in the different kinds of cultures of indigenous populations. There's a sense of cooperation, cohabitation, so you allowed snow in. And I guess my question has to do with the manufacturing of interior weather in buildings, which it's a theme that I'm very concerned with in recent years, but also it is a theme that Northern territories are very concerned with. And if we think of histories of famous projects, utopian projects like Fry Oto's and Kengo Kuma's Arctic City, right, which was an entirely manufactured interior controlled space that would provide comfort. I want to ask you, with this kind of super careful recording of these cultures, there's a sense of just not really caring so much about comfort, but living with a certain kind of conditions. And I want to ask your view on that matter. I mean, not just what the indigenous populations think, but what your positions towards that matter are as spatial practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, great question. And you're right. And in some ways, the Fry Auto example of Arctic City is probably sort of also indicative of its time, right? Like this is certainly around a sort of space interest. So the idea of putting domes over large regions is probably more a byproduct of space age, right? This idea of creating or even biosphere sort of notions. You're right, though, like maybe an interesting one and one that's quite problematic is to take the case of Ralph Erskine's proposals for Resolute Bay, which actually would be a great case study, an example to show. It's been much written about in terms of Arctic studies and Arctic urban studies. And what's interesting about the Erskine project, both it's an exciting, fantastic observation in it, but then a terrifying observation in it. I can cut to the short version of it right here, which is this idea of introducing a wind wall is very exciting and interesting idea to incorporate, in a way you could say, the snow fence, the concept of the snow fence into urban planning or into architecture is very exciting. This kind of environmental design with environment notion. The terrifying product of that was the way in which it reinforced colonial ideas about who lives where. And in fact, it was the Southerners, visitors who were given the sort of wind wall building, and it was the indigenous people that lived on the other, the inside of that. And that allowed for effectively snow from the wind wall to be deposited onto the homes of the indigenous. So there was a collective failure within that in terms of finding a space between innovative planning and inclusive, recognition of what are indigenous perspectives or what are indigenous desires. And there were some consultation that, anyway, Erskine would be a fascinating case study in terms of both the kind of conflict bound up within environmental inclusion versus indigenous knowledge. There's a real challenge there, but maybe you wanted to add something.
I mean, I think also it's interesting at a kind of much smaller scale, we know in the West, or maybe in kind of contemporary culture, there's mechanical engineers have defined some ideal thermal and moisture level contents, and we design for that, and we then engineer our building envelopes and our mechanical systems to perpetually maintain that. And of course, in the North, when you've got a kind of thermal discrepancy of sometimes easily 60 degrees, it really calls into question, could we expand our notions of comfort? And does comfort always have to be 21 degrees Celsius in every space all the time? And it was interesting, on the Iqaluit project, at one point, the mechanical engineers were like, well, of course, we'll set the, we're talking about the mechanical systems. And she said, well, I want an openable window in every space. Like, this is important. And you could see them just sort of, their minds slightly blowing up, because it produced irregularity, especially in the context of the North. But I think there was, a kind of recognition that the building wouldn't always be at a single temperature, and it could handle fluctuations, and that was just kind of part of how one lives in the North, even in this kind of relatively modern building. So I think at multiple scales, this is a really interesting question. And I think thinking about degrees of comfort and what activities need what level of comfort and conditioning is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's your answers are very, very important. And it's not just a question of regulating atmospheres in a new material, but as you very rightfully pointed out, it becomes a tool to structure ways to design and settle spaces. And as you mentioned with the utilidors, I think it was you, Lola, that was mentioning that infrastructure becomes a racial and political instrument because certain people get X amount of comfort and others don't, because they're assumed to want a certain kind of condition. So I think it's an important question that that your very thoughtful investigations are bringing forward. But I want to open the conversation beyond that point to Maurizio. Has a very good question. I think it would be better if you want to articulate it in your own words or read it from the chat.
So it's tough for me to remember exactly how I
Just read
framed
it
it,
then. You
but
read it.
I'll read it. But first, I'll just say thank you so much for your presentations today. And I know, in the context of an architecture lecture, you're kind of, in a way, there's an assumption that you should just show the buildings and the thought that went behind the buildings. But I think it's also important, and this is the reason why I wrote this question, to show the things that were not made for a particular reason, or in particular, anti-colonial, post-colonial, or indigenous survival. So I'll just read the question. The case studies you shared with us allow us to see a process of learning from local practices and vernaculars, including indigenous knowledge and ways of reading and harvesting the landscape. They also bring up a lot of complicated issues seen under the umbrella of a re-territorialization of the many Norths into an uninhabitable North. The majority of the designs you shared incorporate indigenous and local knowledges for problem solving, while enabling a Southern population that would otherwise be deterred from entering the Northern landscape without it. Can you share ways in which your work and the experiences and relations it has helped you produce ways to perceive and even recognize ways in which indigenous communities and their culture, traditions, and means of cultural survival or colonial resistance might have also been considered or deterred design meaningfully?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, I don't know if today, maybe this goes back to Lydia's question. I mean, you're right that there are certain Southern notions of comfort that have been sort of adopted in how we build in the North. And originally they were imposed. and I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but I think that most, Indigenous people in the multiple communities sort of are seeking similar levels of comfort in terms of how we build, in terms of the kind of types of spaces. I mean, there are also cultural calibrations, absolutely. So I don't know that I think the buildings are trying to sort of respond to your latter question by recognizing sort of the spatial practices. I mean, I think this is where it tries to sort of be culturally not just relevant, but perhaps a tool of kind of cultural empowerment, having the building sort of carefully tuned to the land in the case of the Yellowknife project, or making sure that the views are carefully calibrated and that people are kind of invited to move through the land, or in the case of a Iqaluit project, even the kind of use of color is tied to a kind of vernacular there, where all the buildings have these sort of range of colors. I mean, granted, those are southern colonial structures originally. So, but I think they're trying to, or recognizing the kind of presence of the snowmobile, which is, I would call it, I mean, it's a modern innovation, but I would call it an indigenous mobility practice. I don't know, Mason.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, Maurizio, it's a great question, is maybe tying back into an interest we certainly share with Lydia in her work, is this, I think we began an interest in the Arctic thinking that it was a question about environment and infrastructure. And then I think a point along the way, it shifted to realizing that that was only scratching the surface, and that then there was a whole host of other things related to, of course, people, culture. And I'd say my sort of latest interest, I think Lola and I share this because we've talked about this a number of times, is in what way is allowing for an Arctic vernacular to emerge, pushing at the very notion of architectural typology. For example, the idea of making a hospital is nonsensical. It's a southern, even the idea of a hospital is a southern importation. The idea of a school is a southern importation, because learning takes place on the land. Learning takes place across many homes and across many experiences, not within a secluded classroom space, right? And so lately, I would say our interest, I don't know where it will go, but it's emerging through these two projects, which is that the critique to architecture from understanding spatial practitioners already inhabiting these regions and allowing them to be part of the design process is they push back at the very notion of a building being labeled by what it is, a library, a house, a school. But instead, these things are combinatory. These things are a soupy mix of many different things. It depends on who's there and how they use it. So the possibility of space to be more flexible, more inclusive, I'd say, is the most humbling learning from that we have had in recent years, continuing to look at this project, whereas it began as a question about environment, a question about infrastructure. I think that's been what is intriguing us the most at this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answers. I do have another question, but I want to address the questions of the audience before we close. David Lieberman thanks you for your work, and he has visited Yellowknife and a lot of the northern territories that you mentioned, asking for a distinction between the Inuit and the Den. I don't know, David, if you want to expand on your question, or whether I'm doing justice to it or not.
Yeah, well, here we are on a cold winter's day, and I note, I hope
your volume is very low. I don't know if you are heard.
That's why.
Yep.
That's
better? Much better. Yeah.
Yeah, on a cold winter's day, maybe to expand a bit, the difference, and it goes back to Mason and Lola were just talking of cultural practice and spatial practice, and the distinctions between the Dene, the people collectively of of Yellowknife, and Iqaluit, or as when I was there, it was still Frobisher Bay, so a very long time ago, is quite different. And it does make for a different dynamic in terms of learning, in terms of health of communities. I noticed there was another question from someone about the images, the paintings, the things. And again, much of this, what we've called practice, is one of the beautiful things of your Venice Biennale exhibition of taking the soapstone carvings, but back almost to the scale of their tradition rather than what has happened in recent years at a large scale sculpture, because they used to be the fetish object that could be carried in your pocket and rubbed in the palm of your hand. So there's a whole scaling, or sorry, I'm going on a bit, or Old Town in Yellowknife, which is the most vibrant collection of rainbow colors and has become, oh, well, this is the Dene. No, it's not. It was all the surplus paint from the federal government that every year a different, box of paint cans would arrive, and yet it somehow was adopted and utilized to develop an expression. But if you could maybe talk a little about the difference between the Innu and the Dene, I think for those who don't know the North, it's very important. The other thing I would add to those who didn't read my thanks is just the wonders of walking through the snow and having your footprints disappear, but your memories remain.
Yes. Well, David, thanks so much for, it's great to have you here, and somebody who knows Iqaluit and Yellowknife as well as you do, and a dear colleague. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think no lecture would do justice without kind of clarifying these distinctions and kind of letting them speak for themselves. I hope at least one thing, speaking of this idea of sort of familiarizing yourself with the Indigenous people where you are, is to allow these people to speak for themselves. I think also, in short though, the Dene and the Inuit, a major distinction is just inland versus coast. Diet becomes a major distinction from there, and also ways in which treaties, like more in terms of politics and federal relationships with Canada, is the way in which they've either negotiated treaties or land agreements. So there's a number of differences, but essentially Dene are people who are more in the interior, more within forested areas, and Inuit are more coastal, more above the tree line, would be a shorthand distinction. And
actually,
language is
technically the
radically
Innu
different.
are another group altogether. The Innu are in sort of mid-tier Quebec, and are also in a kind of forested region like the Dene. Whereas I think one of the defining criteria of the Inuit is they are always above the tree line. I don't think there are any, at least traditionally, Inuit communities below the tree line.
And there's continuity with Greenland there. There's the Greenlandic Inuit are literally sisters with the Canadian Inuit. They don't distinguish. For some reason, if you look it up, they are called Greenlandic Inuit, but I don't think they self-identify as we are Greenlandic Inuit. They identify as Inuit without a national sort of moniker to that.
The only other thing, and I had meant to actually say this at the beginning of the lecture, but I'm glad I'm still remembering to say this, is, I think we're we are constantly aware that we are Southern Canadians, visitors into all these contexts. And, I worry that we might be taken as any kind of authority, because we go there knowing how little we know, and that I think this is, part of the fascination is that there's, every region has its own richness, but that we are very much kind of there to learn and not.
But I think a transferable, I think both through that humbling exercises of realizing how little you know, the more you dig at something, the more you try to understand something, is how critical and important, even more so now, listening is to the arsenal of the designer. The designer is not purely what kind of creative notions can come forth from my head, but so much as what creative forces can come forth through conversation, through dialogue, through collaboration. And I do think that I'm most interested in things that we've been developing right now is different kind of tools that allow for conversational, almost work as a form of translation or as a form of kind of a gaming, if you will. And that is actually a form of collaborative and participatory listening rather than just the passive act of listening. It's actually active listening is developing a set of collaborative designing with tools. I'm really interested in that as a critique of architecture. And you could think of Giancarlo De Carlo and others who are really interested in forms of participation, which are critical. And architects are constantly confronted with designing for those they don't know, right? Like we're always designing, unless you're always designing your own house, right? You're always designing for others. The idea of working with and designing with others, it's that same action. Somehow it's when that other is so radically different, a new form of engagement, a new form of listening probably is mandatory. But anyway, we'll leave it there.
That's I hate to leave the conversation. I'll ask one last one, and then we have to wrap it up. I think your answers are so important, and I think the discussion of what constitutes cultural importation relative to programming and how we learn is also very important when we're examining territories where local cultures like the ones that you're analyzing and exploring have been learning by almost an inherent way of passing knowledge from generation to generation, where language is not necessarily a part of passing knowledge, and they're intuitive and instrumental different ways of cohabiting the land, of understanding different kinds of environments. So I guess my question is, how you as interpreters or translators of this, of these cultures that do not use language as their primordial tools of representation, and I do that also, right? I do inventories and catalogs and categories, right? And that alone becomes a kind of language. And I wonder how our tools of categorizing can become more in sync with the subject that we're documenting. And I don't know if you've thought of that, but it's something that has been in my mind very, very intensely.
Yes. No, it's hard to find a singular answer to it, but I do think that this is maybe a simplistic response to your profound question, but I have found that asking of representation to embody both spatial and temporal information to be very fruitful at getting at that. I have found maybe too common, we privilege spatial information in drawing and in representation, and to ask representation to also embody temporality. And I'd say this could be taken as simply as seeing drawing as seriality, seeing drawing as sequential information, or understanding seasonality, or understanding even sort of larger forces like generational representations of things, how buildings age or how a region changes. I have found that, I think that was one of my takeaways from the Many Norths book, was how to draw time or how to draw temporal information, as that was a very productive prompt to necessitate a way of representing something that is ineffable, something that is indescribable, that is difficult to describe, a little bit better. Never perfect than living the real thing, but closer.
I think also, I think in some ways that's maybe like the first part of research is like, what even do you look at? Like, so in the case, I don't know if we made the multiple Norths maps at the very beginning, but it was, a long debate, and we had interesting feedback. It shouldn't have just been Canada, or it should have been not all of Northern Canada. So this question of like, what are the filters by which you even approach the research? And I think, on this question of temporality, I think how people use the space, and this is where for us, like the work happens to be regionally specific, but I've supervised theses of students working in Africa and Latin America, in Asia. And for me, what is interesting is the role of drawing at multiple scales and at multiple granularities as a way of understanding the place. And one thing we didn't really talk about, but this notion of vernacular for us, it was a very deliberate move away from a kind of Rudofsky understanding of vernacular, or a Kenneth Frampton even understanding of vernacular, where it's the sort of architectural form and materials, and granted sometimes ideas of like how it performs passively in terms of energies and so forth, but that it's much more a kind of vernacular practices are on equal footing with the actual architecture, and how does that building get used, or how does that courtyard get used over time across seasons, going back to Mason's point. So, I find for me, like getting, whether it's ourselves or students, to kind of draw a kind of very fine-grained understanding, whether it's of climate or people, becomes really important.
Well, I think this has been an extraordinary conversation, and I only wish to continue it in a real location where our bodies meet in physical space soon enough. I hope that. I want to thank everybody for attending this lecture. Have a good day, the rest of the day, and congratulations on your super important work. Thank you so much for joining us, Mason and Lola.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Maurizio, and thanks everyone for attending.